Hey guys, tonight we walk out onto the Giza plateau in the soft dark before sunrise, when the air still holds a little night cool, and the limestone seems to breathe out yesterday's heat. In front of you, the Sphinx waits with that famous broken nose calm, and the question hanging over the sand is not only what it is, but what may or might not lie beneath it. Some parts of this story are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination meant to follow clues without pretending they are certainties? Historians debate archaeology suggests, and old rumours could be doing what old rumours do best, which is wearing dramatic cloaks. You probably won't survive this journey if your plan is to stay awake by counting every internet conspiracy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cozy tonight, post your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand there in your imagination with sand under your shoes and the giant stone face ahead of you, and the first thing you notice is how strange the scale feels. Photos flatten it, videos flatten it. Your brain very helpfully also flattens it. But in person, or even in a careful mental picture, the Sphinx has the kind of size that makes your internal narrator lower its voice without being asked. Most historians agree that the Great Sphinx of Giza belongs to the Old Kingdom setting of the Giza Pyramid complex, and that it is usually associated with the reign of Khafra, even though some details of sequence and interpretation remain debated. That is the solid ground. The evidence we do have points to a monument shaped from limestone bedrock on the plateau, later repaired many times and repeatedly buried and uncovered by drifting sand. In other words, even before anyone asks about secret chambers, the Sphinx is already a monument with a long, messy life story. And honestly, that is usually where the mystery begins, not with a trapdoor, but with maintenance. You look toward the paws, the long body stretched behind them, and the shallow basin cut around the figure. The stone colour changes across the surface, and even in low light, you can imagine where weathering and repairs make patchwork history out of one giant form. Archaeology suggests the monument we see now is both ancient sculpture, an ancient restoration project, and later restoration project, and modern conservation concern, all layered together like a lasagna made of limestone and paperwork. That image may not sound glamorous, but stay with it. Lasagna can still be sacred. One interpretation is that the Sphinx's silence encourages people to fill in the blanks with whatever they most want to find. Lost wisdom, hidden tunnels, forbidden archives, royal secrets, cosmic maps, maybe a snack drawer for priests. A more cautious explanation could be that monumental architecture simply creates psychological pressure. You see something enormous and old, and your mind politely refuses to believe the surface is the whole story. Historians still argue whether some features and weathering patterns around the Sphinx should be read mainly through conventional geological and archaeological explanations, or whether they invite broader debates about timing erosion and later modifications. That debate does not automatically prove anything hidden beneath the monument, but it does help explain why the Sphinx keeps attracting both careful scholars and enthusiastic theorists with very dramatic thumbnails. And since we are keeping the solid ground separate from the mist, let's do that gently here. What's broadly accepted is that Egyptologists and archaeologists approach the Sphinx as part of a wider royal and ritual landscape, not as a standalone riddle dropped in the desert by a mysterious delivery service. The pyramids, temples, causeways, quarries and surrounding structures all matter for context. When you ask what may be beneath the Sphinx, scholars would usually first ask what is beneath this part of the plateau geologically, what was cut during construction, what was repaired later, and what evidence has actually been documented. That sounds less cinematic than a forbidden chamber. It's also how you avoid accidentally excavating a rumour. Still, the mood of the place does something to you. You can feel it even in imagination. Dawn begins to lift and the edges of the face brighten first. The body remains dim a little longer. Sand gathers in shallow folds near the enclosure walls. A bird crosses the sky and is gone. In that half-light, it is easy to understand why generations of travellers, rulers, workers, pilgrims, photographers, and armchair detectives have looked at this monument and wondered whether the biggest secret is underground. A popular rumour claims there are hidden passageways or sealed chambers directly beneath the Sphinx that authorities know about and refuse to reveal. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumour tells us more than one thing at once. It tells us people sense there is unfinished knowledge here. It tells us restrictions at famous heritage sites can look suspicious from the outside. And it tells us the human brain absolutely loves a locked door, even when the door might just be a fracture in limestone. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. So tonight you are not marching in with a shovel and a dramatic soundtrack. You are walking slowly with a flashlight that mostly illuminates your own breath and assumptions. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the first clue is simple. The Sphinx has spent much of its existence half lost in sand, half restored by human hands, and fully capable of making people project stories onto its face. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real beginning of the beneath the Sphinx question is not a hidden chamber at all, but the long history of burial, exposure, repair, and rumour that makes every generation think it might be the one to finally understand what it is looking at? You keep standing there as the sun rises a little more and the limestone warms from grey to honey. The plateau starts to feel less like a stage set and more like a work site that never really closed, only paused. Somewhere in the distance, modern Cairo exists with traffic coffee alarms and people already checking messages they do not want to answer. Here the Sphinx keeps its expression and gives you nothing extra for free, which, if we are being fair, is excellent branding. And that is where you begin, not with certainty, not with panic, and not with a magical map hidden in your backpack, but with a giant old monument, a patient question, and the quiet understanding that the first mystery may be the silence itself. You keep your eyes on the stone a little longer, and as the morning grows clearer, the Sphinx starts to look less like a single object, and more like a process frozen in place. The face, the body, the pores, the enclosure around it, the uneven texture of the limestone, the cut lines in the surrounding bedrock, all of it begins to whisper the same practical truth. This is not a statue hauled in from somewhere else. Most historians agree that the Great Sphinx was carved directly from the living limestone bedrock of the Giza plateau, and that detail matters more than it first seems, because once a monument is carved from living rock, the ground beneath it is no longer just beneath. It is part of the same story. Archaeology suggests that the Sphinx and its enclosure reflect quarrying carving and reuse patterns that tie the monument to the larger construction landscape around Giza. The evidence we do have points to ancient workers cutting down into the plateau to isolate the mass that would become the Sphinx, then shaping the body from what remained while removing stone from around it. Some of that removed limestone may have been used in nearby temple structures. This is the mainstream anchor, and it is already a fascinating image. You are not picturing a sculptor with a lonely hammer and a dramatic sunset. You are picturing organised labour planning, surveying, hauling, shaping, reshaping, and probably a lot of dust in places nobody wanted dust. So much dust, in fact, that if you could time travel there, your first great archaeological discovery might be that everyone needs a nap. A careful reading might suggest the quarrying sequence matters when later generations start asking about cracks, cavities, channels, or suspicious-looking depressions. If the Sphinx is carved from layered limestone, and if the enclosure walls and floor were cut through different natural strata, then the plateau itself may produce features that look purposeful even when they are geological. Limestone can vary in hardness. It can weather unevenly. It can fracture. It can hold voids or weak zones. It can also be modified later by human hands in ways that are hard to separate at a glance from the ancient work. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it's exactly why arguments around what's beneath become so sticky. Historians still argue whether particular marks, surfaces, and forms around the Sphinx should be read mainly as original quarry and carving, evidence, later restoration and clearing activity, natural weathering, or some combination of all three. You can feel the debate hiding inside the stone itself. One person sees a cut, another sees erosion, a third sees both and starts a thread online with 12 arrows and the words "they don't want you to know" in glowing red text. Sleep-friendly reminder they may simply want you to file a permit application. What's broadly accepted is that the Sphinx sits in a carved enclosure and the monument's body is composed of geological layers with different qualities. That basic fact helps explain why some sections weathered badly and needed repairs while others held shape more strongly. It also explains why the Sphinx can look ancient and patched at the same time, like a masterpiece that has spent millennia in a sandblasting booth and then gone through repeated emergency spa treatments. One interpretation is that the very act of cutting the enclosure around the Sphinx could have created spaces, trenches, or work-related features nearby that later viewers misread as entrances. Imagine labourers carving around the future body, extracting stone, levelling surfaces, and making temporary routes or work areas. Then imagine centuries of sand burying and revealing different parts of that terrain. It's possible that a practical construction scar glimpsed in one season and buried the next becomes the seed of a story. By the time the story returns, the scar is now a sealed passage. Add a traveller's diary, a translation issue, and one enthusiastic cousin, and suddenly you have a legend. This theory isn't widely accepted as an explanation for every tunnel rumour, but it is a useful way to think. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it helps keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And the mist, to be fair, is very persuasive at sunrise. You move your attention from the face to the broad back and then down toward the base where stone meets cut floor. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if beneath the Sphinx does not always mean a grand hidden chamber, but a more complicated underground reality made of natural geology, quarry cuts, repair trenches, and later probes? That version is less movie trailer, more field notebook. It is also in many cases how ancient sites really behave. They are messy, they are layered, they contain human intention and natural structure in the same footprint, and the boundary between them is not always obvious. A fringe idea proposes that the Sphinx was intentionally placed over a major hidden complex from the beginning, with secret planners designing chambers below and symbolic monuments above. We'll keep the soft framing here. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence usually cited for it is debated incomplete or interpretive rather than conclusive. Still, the idea persists because it gives the monument a dramatic vertical storyline: face above, secrets below, sunlit symbol, buried archive. It's almost too narratively tidy, which is usually your clue to lower your voice and ask better questions. A more cautious explanation could be that the vertical storyline people sense is real in a different way. The Sphinx absolutely does have layers of story stacked through space: surface carving, bedrock composition, enclosure cuts, sand deposits, restoration phases, modern surveying, conservation interventions, public imagination. You may not need a hidden vault for the site to feel deep. It already is. The evidence we do have points to a monument whose stone quality varies enough to create maintenance challenges from very early on. That matters because repair work can create or alter cavities, fill zones, seams, and strange-looking interfaces. If later observers encounter one of these features without the full context, it may raise the possibility of hidden architecture where none was intended. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it is a healthy reminder that archaeology often deals with traces of traces, not pristine original conditions. And you can almost hear the tools now in that imagined old worksite rhythm: chisels, hammers, voices, the scrape of sledges, dust in the throat, someone complaining about stone quality in exactly the same tone a modern contractor uses when opening a wall and discovering a surprise pipe. Across thousands of years, some workplace emotions remain beautifully unchanged. So as you stay with the Sphinx a little longer, the second clue settles in. The monument is carved from living bedrock, and that means every question about what's beneath must pass through geology and construction first. Before secret halls, there is stone. Before legends, there are layers. Before any dramatic hidden chamber claim deserves attention, you ask the calmer question: what did the rock allow? What did the workers cut, and what did time rearrange? That is not a disappointing answer. It is the beginning of a better mystery. You stay with the stone, but your attention begins to widen because the Sphinx becomes easier to understand when you stop staring only at the face and start looking at the neighbourhood. The Giza Plateau is not one monument plus some bonus sand. It is a planned royal landscape crowded with intention: pyramids, temples, causeways, quarry zones, subsidiary tombs, work areas, alignments, and pathways, all sit in conversation with one another, even when that conversation reaches us only in fragments. What's broadly accepted is that the Great Sphinx is usually linked to the complex of Khafra, the pharaoh of Egypt's 4th dynasty, whose pyramid stands near the monument. Most historians agree that the Sphinx's location style and relationship to nearby structures place it within the architectural and ceremonial context of Khafra's reign, even though scholars continue to debate certain details of chronology, carving sequence, and later modifications. That last part matters. A lot of online arguments begin when someone hears debate and translates it into therefore everything is hidden. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Debate in scholarship usually means specialists are sorting out details inside a broad framework, not throwing the whole framework into the Nile. And honestly, if archaeologists had a slogan, it might be, yes, but define your layer. Archaeology suggests the Sphinx sits near the valley temple and causeway associated with Khafra's pyramid complex, and the evidence we do have points to strong spatial and material relationships among these constructions. Some of the stone used in nearby temple structures may have come from the Sphinx enclosure. One interpretation is that this linkage is practical and symbolic at the same time. Practical because quarrying produces building stone, symbolic because the king's landscape is being shaped as a coherent statement of power, ritual and cosmic order. If that sounds grand, that is because Old Kingdom royal projects were not known for modesty. Nobody carved a lion-bodied guardian into bedrock because they wanted the site to feel minimalist. It's possible that some of the modern mystery around what lies beneath the Sphinx grows from underestimating how planned the plateau may have been. If you imagine the Sphinx as an isolated object, then any anomaly nearby feels like a hidden afterthought. But if you imagine it as one element in a carefully arranged royal environment, then the better question might be whether the landscape itself was designed to work in layers, above and below, visible and invisible, symbolic and practical. That does not confirm secret chambers. It simply widens the field of interpretation. Historians still argue whether every structural relationship around the Sphinx should be read as part of one tightly unified original plan, or whether some features reflect later adaptation, reuse, and restoration over time. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it keeps us from turning a complex site into a single tidy diagram. Ancient builders were skilled, but ancient sites also lived long lives. A plan can be coherent and still be revised. A monument can be intentional and still be altered. If you have ever reorganized one shelf in your house and accidentally redesigned the whole room, you already understand the archaeological principle. A careful reading might suggest that beneath the Sphinx question becomes more interesting when tied to the plateau's planning logic. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real puzzle is not a forbidden chamber under one statue, but the possibility that the Giza plateau as a whole was engineered with more spatial complexity than casual visitors notice ramps, cuts, foundations, drainage concerns, quarry boundaries, ritual access routes, and later repairs could all contribute to subsurface features without requiring a mythical library under the pores. A fringe idea proposes that the Sphinx marks the entrance to a lost pre-pharaonic complex, older than the accepted Old Kingdom context, and deliberately concealed by later dynasties. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because it combines two irresistible ingredients, older than everyone says, and hidden by authorities. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can at least ask what keeps the idea alive. Usually, it is a mix of real unanswered questions, selective readings of evidence, and the emotional force of the monument itself. The Sphinx looks ancient in a way that makes people feel history must be withholding something. A more cautious explanation could be that the site really is withholding something, just not necessarily the thing rumours promise. The evidence we do have points to normal limits of archaeology, incomplete excavation histories, changing methods, damaged surfaces, conservation constraints, and the plain fact that bedrock landscapes are complicated. In other words, mystery can survive without a conspiracy. Sometimes uncertainty is just uncertainty wearing desert light. And the desert light is doing excellent work this morning. You can imagine walking the plateau, now not as a tourist, sprinting from viewpoint to viewpoint, but slowly following lines. The pyramid rises to one side. Causeways stretch across the terrain. Temple remains sit low and geometric, their stones holding shadows. The Sphinx watches from its enclosure, not alone, but anchored. You begin to feel the site as a network rather than a set of icons. That shift changes your question. Instead of asking, what are they hiding under the Sphinx? You start asking, What functions did this landscape require? And what traces would those functions leave in the ground? That may sound less dramatic, but it is how you move from rumour to clue. Most historians agree that context is king in archaeology, and at Giza the context is unusually rich. If a cavity cut anomaly or inaccessible zone exists somewhere near the Sphinx, its meaning depends on the surrounding architecture and chronology. One interpretation is that public fascination often skips this step because context is not as thrilling as the phrase hidden chamber. But the hidden chamber phrase is a little like ordering dessert before checking whether the kitchen is real. Tempting, yes. Reliable, not always. So the third clue settles into place as the sun rises higher and the stone loses some of its dawn mystery and gains a harder, clearer edge. The Sphinx is probably not the beginning of the story. It is part of a planned royal landscape usually associated with Khafre, and the question of what lies beneath may start with how the plateau itself was organised, cut and used. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and if the mist drifts back, in which it always does around Giza, at least now you know where to place your feet. As the light settles across the plateau, and the edges of the stone sharpen your attention, drifts downward toward the area between the Sphinx's paws, where one of the most famous pieces of evidence in the whole story stands, quietly doing exactly what old monuments do best. It says something important, says it in royal language, and still leaves room for questions. This is where the Dream Stele enters the scene, and with it the strange mix of memory, restoration, ambition, and political messaging that can make a buried monument feel even more mysterious. Archaeology suggests that the Dream Stele placed between the paws of the Great Sphinx dates to the reign of Thutmose IV in the 18th dynasty, long after the Sphinx was first carved in the Old Kingdom. Most historians agree that the stele commemorates a royal story in which the young prince, not yet king, encounters the Sphinx and receives a promise of kingship after clearing the sand around it. What's broadly accepted is that this inscription links the Sphinx to restoration and royal legitimacy, not just awe and scenery. In other words, even in ancient times, the Sphinx was not simply there. It was already a monument that needed attention, interpretation, and public storytelling. You can imagine the scene the stele wants you to picture: a prince resting in the shadow of the giant lion-bodied figure, the desert heat pressing down the stone face, watching the sands piled high around the body, and a dream carrying authority. Whether you read it as pious memory, political symbolism, or both, the message is elegant. Care for this ancient power and kingship follows. It is almost suspiciously good branding, which is exactly why scholars read it carefully. One interpretation is that the Dream Stele preserves a genuine restoration moment while also presenting that moment in a way that strengthens royal legitimacy. A careful reading might suggest the monument is doing two jobs at once, recording an act of clearing and framing Thutmose IV as the chosen restorer of a sacred ancient guardian. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every detail, because royal inscriptions are not neutral field reports. They are closer to ceremonial announcements with excellent stonework. Historians still argue whether specific damaged or missing portions of the Dream Stele originally included wording that would sharpen our understanding of the Sphinx's identity, age, or relation to kingship in ways we can no longer fully reconstruct. The evidence we do have points to an inscription rich in symbolism, but incomplete in places, which means interpretation enters the room whether we like it or not. And once interpretation enters, mystery usually pulls up a chair. The mainstream anchor here is clear. The stele shows that by the New Kingdom, the Sphinx was already ancient, partially buried by sand and significant enough to merit royal restoration and inscription. That matters for our Beneath the Sphinx question, because it reminds you that burial and clearing cycles are not modern discoveries. Ancient Egyptians themselves dealt with the monument as something that disappeared into sand and had to be reclaimed. And when a monument disappears and reappears across centuries, stories naturally collect in the gaps. A popular rumour claims the area between the pores, or beneath the Sphinx, was always known to conceal a secret chamber, and that later rulers encoded hints in inscriptions without saying it directly. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist here. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the Dream Stele is not mainstream evidence of a hidden subterranean archive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, what it may show instead is how sacred restoration and royal memory can later be reimagined as clues to something physically concealed. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the buried pores mattered not because they guarded treasure, but because they turned the Sphinx into a recurring drama of loss and return? Sand rises, sand is cleared, a ruler claims devotion. The monument speaks again through inscription. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And the Dream Stele sits right at that boundary. It gives us a documented anchor and then politely refuses to answer every question we bring to it. A more cautious explanation could be that later hidden chamber theories draw emotional power from this exact combination: an already ancient monument, partial burial, royal restoration, and sacred language. Put those together and you get a perfect recipe for speculation. Not fake, not foolish, just human. You see a giant guardian half swallowed by sand, then read a kingly dream narrative carved between its pores, and your brain immediately says, okay, but what else is down there? Your brain is trying its best. It has watched too many documentaries with thunder sound effects. Archaeology suggests the stele and surrounding area also remind us how much of the Sphinx's history is about surface access and conservation, not just underground fantasies. Clearing sand around the monument would have required labour organisation and choices about what to expose and what to stabilise. The evidence we do have points to repeated human intervention across centuries. That means the visible space around the Sphinx is already shaped by many hands and many eras. If a feature looks mysterious today, it may belong to one of those episodes rather than to a single original secret. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The Dream Stele is documented. Its political and symbolic texture invites interpretation. Any hidden archive reading beneath it belongs to the mist, unless stronger evidence appears. Still in the soft mental picture we are building, you can stand before the pores and feel how easily stone becomes memory, and memory becomes rumour. The inscription is not merely text, it is a royal act of framing the Sphinx for future generations. It tells you that this monument matters, that it was buried, that it was cleared, that kingship and care were linked. It does not hand you a map, it hands you a mood, a relationship and a question. And that question deepens the longer you look. If New Kingdom rulers treated the Sphinx as ancient and worthy of restoration, what layers of meaning had already accumulated by then? What was remembered correctly, what was reinterpreted, and what had already slipped into silence? One interpretation is that the true guarded thing may be cultural memory itself, preserved in fragments, inscriptions and rituals, rather than in a single hidden room under stone pores. By now the sun is higher, the shadows shorter, and the giant face less dreamlike and more stern. Yet the feeling remains. The fourth clue is not a tunnel entrance. It is a stela, a slab of carved text between the pores linking sand, kingship restoration and memory. And once you notice that the Sphinx becomes harder to read as a simple object and easier to read as a monument that has been narrating itself for thousands of years, one careful, incomplete message at a time. You stay near the Sphinx a little longer, and the next clue arrives not as a stone carving or inscription, but as something much less dramatic and somehow more powerful. Sand. Endless, patient, shape-shifting sand. It piles, slips, hardens, drifts and returns. It hides things slowly enough that a generation can call something permanent, and reveals things suddenly enough that the next generation thinks it has discovered a secret. Most historians agree that the Great Sphinx was buried by drifting sand many times across its long history, sometimes up to the neck, and that repeated clearing campaigns were necessary to expose its body and enclosure. Archaeology suggests these cycles of burial and exposure are central to understanding the monument's condition, repair, history, and the stories that grew around it. The evidence we do have points to a pattern that is both practical and myth-making at once. If a monument repeatedly disappears and reappears, people do not just maintain it. They narrate it. And they narrate it with confidence, even when they are guessing. You can picture the process across centuries. Wind shifts, sand accumulates in the enclosure, the body vanishes gradually, the pores become less distinct, the floor disappears. Then in some later period, labourers arrive, dig hole, clear, and suddenly surfaces emerge that no one nearby has seen in living memory. Freshly exposed cuts, seams, patched stone depressions, channels and irregular textures appear in sharp sunlight. If you are a careful excavator, you make notes. If you are a traveller with a vivid imagination, you invent a legend by dinner. One interpretation is that many mysterious features reported near the Sphinx over time may have looked more striking in the immediate aftermath of clearing than they do now. A careful reading might suggest that shadows loose, fill uneven surfaces, and partly exposed rock can create powerful visual illusions, especially at dawn or late afternoon. It's possible that a trench edge erosion pocket or restoration seam glimpsed during a partial excavation later gets remembered as an entrance to something hidden below. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it fits how memory often works at archaeological sites. We remember the drama of first sight more than the follow-up measurements. Historians still argue whether certain reports from different periods describe the same features at the Sphinx enclosure, different features seen under changing conditions or observations, distorted by incomplete clearing and later retelling. This is where the sand becomes almost like a co-author. It edits the monument between generations. It changes what is visible, what can be measured, what can be sketched, and what gets exaggerated. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And shifting sand is very good at widening that gap. What's broadly accepted is that burial and exposure cycles also affected the Sphinx's preservation. Sand could protect some surfaces for a time by shielding them from wind erosion, while exposure could accelerate wear and reveal vulnerable stone. The evidence we do have points to a complicated relationship between danger and protection. The same sand that hides details can also preserve them. The same clearing that helps scholars inspect the monument can also expose weak areas to weather and damage. Ancient conservation, modern conservation, and rumour generation all end up sharing the same workspace. A popular rumour claims workers or officials have repeatedly uncovered openings near the Sphinx and then quietly reburied them. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. This theory isn't widely accepted as a general historical conclusion, and many versions of the story rely on second-hand retellings rather than consistent documentation. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a more cautious explanation could be that real clearing episodes uncovered ambiguous features, and later protection backfilling or stabilisation was interpreted as concealment. Fence it, cover part of it again, and stop. Fence it, cover part of it again, and stop access. Your inner detective says cover up. The field team may be saying the wall is unstable while holding clipboards and trying not to lose a decade of work to one bad decision. Both stories involve tension. Only one usually involves hard hats. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the recurring, they found something and hid it? Narrative around the Sphinx reflects a real pattern, not of secret treasure but of temporary visibility. A feature appears during a clearing campaign. It is examined, stabilised, filled, protected, or simply obscured again by natural processes. Observers carry away different memories of what they saw. Years later, the retelling hardens. Add the word beneath and the story grows roots. Archaeology suggests that context during excavation matters as much as the feature itself. A cavity in bedrock means one thing if it is clearly natural, another if tool marks define it, and another if later repair mortar surrounds it. The evidence we do have points to the importance of controlled recording, which earlier eras did not always do to modern standards. That gap in method does not prove secrets. It raises the possibility of confusion, and confusion is excellent fuel for legends. You can almost see the shifting scene now across time like a slow montage. Workers in one era hauling baskets of sand, a ruler claiming restoration credit, a traveller sketching a half-exposed profile, a photographer catching dramatic shadows in a newly cleared trench, a modern conservation team placing barriers, tourists leaning for the perfect angle while the guide says something half factual, half theatrical, because honestly that is part of the job. The Sphinx remains still while the visible evidence changes around it. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. What is documented is repeated burial and clearing. What is interpreted is how those episodes affected what people thought they saw. What is imagined calmly and carefully is the feeling of a monument surfacing again after long silence, making each generation feel like it has interrupted an unfinished sentence. And maybe that is the heart of this section's clue. Before we leap to hidden halls and forbidden archives, we have to respect the simple power of sand. It hides. It reveals, it edits memory, it creates first impressions that become rumours, and rumours that sound older than they are. The Sphinx has not just survived history, it has been staged by the desert itself over and over, each unveiling a little different from the last. So when someone says a passage was seen, or a doorway appeared, or officials quickly closed access, you now have a calmer lens. Maybe. Possibly. Historians debate. The sand changes everything, and sometimes the most mysterious thing at Giza is not what lies deep below the stone, but what becomes visible for one brief season and then slips back into shadow. You let the sand settle in your mind, and once it does, another important thought rises with it. Part of the reason people so readily imagine hidden spaces beneath the Sphinx is that Egypt in general really does contain hidden spaces. Shafts, chambers, corridors, voids, blocking stones, sealed rooms, unfinished cuts, and strange little architectural surprises are all part of the archaeological landscape. So the instinct is not completely wild, it just needs supervision. The evidence we do have points to real subterranean and internal features in many Egyptian monuments, especially tombs, pyramids, temple foundations, and burial complexes. Most historians agree that ancient Egyptian builders worked with both above-ground and below-ground spaces for practical ritual and symbolic reasons. Archaeology suggests shafts might serve burial access, security storage, drainage considerations, construction, sequencing, or later reuse depending on the site and period. This is mainstream solid ground, and it matters because it explains why. Maybe there's something underneath can sound plausible before any evidence is shown. The problem begins when plausible becomes automatic. One interpretation is that people apply a true general pattern too quickly to a specific monument. You learn that Egyptian sites often include hidden or inaccessible spaces, so your brain politely upgrades every major monument into a guaranteed chamber machine. The Sphinx, being visually dramatic and permanently unsmiling, gets upgraded first. A more cautious explanation could be that while Egypt certainly has many underground features, each site has its own purpose, geology, and construction logic. The fact that one monument has a shaft does not mean another one must have a secret hall beneath it. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it is a useful sentence to keep in your pocket. Historians still argue whether some subsurface anomalies or openings reported near the Sphinx should be interpreted as natural geological features. Later interventions limited probes or evidence of more substantial constructed spaces. Notice how careful that wording has to be, not because anyone is trying to dodge the question, but because this is what honesty looks like when the evidence is partial. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. What's broadly accepted is that the Giza plateau as a whole contains a complicated mix of natural bedrock variation and human modification. Pyramids, tombs, quarry cuts, and later excavations all contribute to a landscape where underground features are not unusual in principle. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the Sphinx question becomes less, is there something hidden because Egypt is mysterious and more? What kind of feature, if any, would make sense here in this geological and architectural context? That is a better question, even if it gets fewer clicks. A fringe idea proposes that because Egyptian sacred architecture often encoded symbolic journeys, the Sphinx must sit atop a major initiation chamber or esoteric passage used by priests. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it hangs around because it offers a narratively satisfying blend of spirituality, secrecy, and architecture. It turns the monument into a doorway, and people love doorways, especially symbolic ones. If your imagination is already standing on the plateau at sunrise, it is very easy to picture a hidden descent beneath the paused torchlight on carved walls, and some solemn ancient official looking at you like you forgot the password. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Archaeology suggests caution for another reason too. Hidden spaces in Egypt come in many scales. Some are monumental chambers, some are narrow shafts, some are voids caused by geology or construction gaps, some are later intrusions, some are damage, some are exactly as exciting as they sound, and some are the archaeological equivalent of opening a closet and finding old scaffolding. A careful reading might suggest that public imagination often jumps immediately to the grandest possible version. If a survey hints at an anomaly, people picture a library. If a cavity is detected, people imagine a royal archive. If an access point is restricted, people assume secrets rather than stabilisation. To be clear, this is debated, and the debate itself is not proof of a hidden chamber. It is evidence that the question is hard. You can feel the pull of pattern recognition here. You are human. You notice that Egyptian civilization built underground in many contexts. You notice the Sphinx is one of the most iconic monuments on Earth. You combine the two and get a strong intuition that they must connect. Intuition is not useless. It is often where good questions begin, but archaeology asks intuition to slow down, bring a notebook, and stop declaring victory before lunch. A popular rumour claims that explorers long ago found a passage beneath the Sphinx similar to hidden corridors elsewhere in Egypt, and then concealed the evidence. Will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. This theory isn't widely accepted, and reports tied to it are usually inconsistent, anecdotal, or disconnected from controlled excavation records. A more cautious explanation could be that real features probes or access points near the Sphinx have been observed at different times, then folded into a larger story by analogy with genuinely hidden spaces found in other monuments. That process is incredibly common in history writing at the popular level. You take one real category, one famous site, and one unresolved question, and your brain assembles a greatest hits album. Entertaining, yes. Reliable, maybe not. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is documented that Egyptian monuments often include hidden or subsurface components. It is interpretation to extend that general pattern to likely possibilities at the Sphinx. It becomes imagination when the possible feature turns into a fully furnished underground archive with dramatic acoustics and a destiny. And yet, even with all that caution, the question remains worth asking. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the useful insight here is not whether the Sphinx has one legendary chamber, but that Egypt trained us to expect depth, literally and symbolically, the civilization built in layers of stone ritual and meaning? So when we face the Sphinx, we naturally ask what lies beneath. That instinct is not foolish. It just needs evidence to guide it. By now, the plateau in your mind is brighter, the stone warmer, and your footing steadier. The sixth clue is this: yes, ancient Egypt truly contains shafts and chambers and hidden spaces, and that real pattern gives the Sphinx rumours their persuasive force. But pattern is not proof. Before expectation becomes conclusion, we pause, look at the specific monument, and let the evidence speak at its own slow desert pace. By now you've learned to watch the stone, the sand, the layers, and your own expectations. The next thing you have to watch is the paper trail, or more accurately, the places where the paper trail gets thin, messy, contradictory, or missing altogether. Because long before modern archaeological standards tightened, the Sphinx passed through the hands and notebooks of travellers, antiquarians, surveyors, officials, engineers, excavators, photographers, and enthusiastic men with hats large enough to cast their own weather systems. What's broadly accepted is that 19th and early 20th century work around Giza, including around the Sphinx, was documented unevenly by modern standards. Most historians agree that valuable observations were made during these periods, but methods, recording styles, publication practices, and preservation priorities varied widely. Archaeology suggests that some early reports are careful and useful, while others are partial, sensational, second-hand, or difficult to verify. The evidence we do have points to a mixed archive, and mixed archives are exactly where mystery stories go to get stronger. One interpretation is that gaps in documentation around a famous site like the Sphinx can feel more suspicious than they really are. A careful reading might suggest that what looks like a missing secret record is sometimes just ordinary historical chaos, unpublished notes, poor cataloguing, lost correspondence, damaged photographs, inconsistent terminology or work that never reached final publication. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every case. But it is common enough that historians keep saying it with the tired patience of people who have opened too many boxes labelled miscellaneous. Historians still argue whether certain old claims about openings, probes, or features near the Sphinx reflect genuine observations, later misunderstood, exaggerated reporting, translation problems, or outright speculation added after the fact. And this is where modern listeners can get tripped up. You hear there are conflicting reports, and your brain wants a villain. Sometimes there is no villain. Sometimes there is just a century-old notebook, 3 different spellings of the same place name, and a sketch that appears to have been drawn on a moving camel. The mainstream anchor remains steady. Early exploration history matters, but it has to be handled carefully. The evidence we do have points to real work around the Sphinx over many periods, including clearance, repair, inspection and recording. But not all of it meets modern archaeological expectations for context, precision and transparency. That does not mean everything is fake or hidden. It means the archive itself is an artifact shaped by the habits and limitations of the people who made it. And people as a category are not always ideal filing systems. A popular rumour claims early explorers discovered major hidden structures beneath the Sphinx and then either hid the evidence, sold it, or reported it privately to powerful institutions. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. This theory isn't widely accepted as a mainstream historical conclusion, and versions of it often combine unrelated names, dates and incidents into one dramatic plot. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a more cautious explanation could be that early investigators sometimes encountered ambiguous features, recorded them incompletely, and left behind just enough uncertainty for later generations to imagine the rest. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Archaeology suggests another reason the paper trail gets complicated around the Sphinx. The monument has been studied and visited for a very long time by many kinds of observers with different goals. Some came to measure, some came to restore, some came to collect inscriptions or compare styles. Some came because the Sphinx was famous and they wanted to be near the famous thing. One person's minor crack in limestone surface near enclosure wall becomes another person's possible shaft entrance after retelling, and by the third retelling it is sealed tunnel found by expedition details suppressed. That is not always deceit. Often it is narrative evolution doing what narrative evolution does. A fringe idea proposes that entire batches of early records about the Sphinx were deliberately removed from public view because they describe discoveries that would challenge accepted Egyptian chronology. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because it turns archival messiness into intention. It is emotionally satisfying to imagine a hidden cabinet labelled "Do Not Open." The less glamorous reality may be scattered notes conflicting institutional ownership, fragile materials, and generations of scholarship trying to reconstruct what earlier observers meant. If you have ever tried to find one photo on your phone and accidentally discovered 3,000 screenshots, you are already spiritually prepared for historical archives. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the recurring claim that someone found something and the records vanished reflects a real frustration with how incomplete early archaeology can feel, especially at world-famous sites? The Sphinx attracts monumental expectations. People want a clean timeline, a complete set of reports, and definitive answers. Instead, they often find partial documentation, evolving interpretations, and references that do not quite line up. One interpretation is that this mismatch between expectation and archive creates the sensation of concealment, even when the underlying cause is inconsistency rather than conspiracy. The evidence we do have points to a genuine methodological lesson. Modern archaeology places so much emphasis on context provenience, careful recording, and publication precisely because earlier periods were often uneven in these respects. A more cautious explanation could be that the Sphinx rumour ecosystem survives partly on old reporting habits that left too much room for ambiguity. Once ambiguity enters a famous site, it tends to stay. It gets quoted, it gets clipped, it gets retranslated, it gets turned into a documentary voiceover with dramatic pause timing so sharp it could cut limestone. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is documented that early records vary in quality and completeness. It is interpretation to connect specific archival gaps to later Sphinx legends. It is imagination where missing paperwork becomes a fully coordinated silence stretching across institutions and centuries. And yet there is a real tenderness in taking these old records seriously, even when they are flawed. You can almost see the people behind them standing in heat and glare, trying to draw measure, describe, or simply make sense of a monument that already looked ancient to them. Their notes may be imperfect, but their uncertainty is familiar. They are doing what you are doing tonight, looking at the Sphinx and asking whether the visible surface is the whole story. So the seventh clue settles quietly into your pocket. Missing or uneven documentation can sound like secrecy, especially at a monument this famous. Sometimes the gap really is a gap, not a lock. And if we remember that we can read old claims with patience instead of panic, curiosity, instead of certainty, and a little sympathy for everyone who tried to write down a giant mystery before modern archaeology handed them better tools. You've looked at the stone, the sand, the royal context, the old records, and the way rumours grow in missing spaces. Now the story takes a turn into modern instruments. And this is where the mystery changes tone. Less torchlight, more cables, less dramatic whispering in tunnels, more people staring at screens and arguing politely about signal strength. Archaeology suggests that modern researchers have used geophysical methods in and around parts of the Giza plateau to investigate subsurface conditions without immediately digging. Most historians agree that non-invasive techniques can be useful for identifying anomalies, void-like signatures, density changes, fractures, and other subsurface irregularities that may deserve further study. What's broadly accepted is that these tools can detect patterns. What they do not automatically do is tell you with perfect certainty what the pattern means. And that distinction is the whole game. One interpretation is that public fascination often treats a geophysical anomaly as if it were a confirmed chamber. A careful reading might suggest a much more modest conclusion. An anomaly is a signal that something differs from its surroundings. It may be natural bedrock variation. It may be a crack zone. It may be loose fill. It may be a cavity. It may be a cup feature. It may be a combination of several things. This is suggestive, not conclusive. But if you post the word anomaly next to a picture of the Sphinx, the internet immediately starts furnishing the room. Historians still argue whether specific reported anomalies near the Sphinx and broader Giza areas are best explained by geology, ancient human activity, later disturbance or limitations in the measurement and interpretation. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it is exactly what serious science looks like at a complicated site. The debate is not failure, the debate is the method doing its job in public, which can look strangely unsatisfying if you were hoping for a giant arrow labelled "Secret Library Here." The evidence we do have points to a bedrock landscape that is uneven, layered and modified across time, which means geophysical readings can be difficult to interpret cleanly. Archaeology suggests that instrument results usually need correlation with geology, known structures, excavation history, and conservation realities before anyone makes strong claims. In other words, the machines are not oracles, they are translators, and sometimes the ancient stone speaks in a dialect. A popular rumour claims that scans have already revealed large hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx, and that authorities simply refuse to admit it. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. This theory isn't widely accepted, and many versions blur together. Different surveys, different locations, different methods, and different levels of certainty. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a more cautious explanation could be that some survey results identified ambiguous subsurface features, and the gap between anomaly and confirmed chamber was filled by public imagination. That gap is where a lot of documentaries buy their soundtrack. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real lesson of geophysics at a site like the Sphinx is not hidden certainty, but structured uncertainty? You are no longer just guessing at cracks in the light. You are measuring differences below the surface. That is progress. But progress in archaeology often means narrowing possibilities, not leaping to final answers. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And geophysical surveys live right on that edge. They give you clues with numbers attached. A fringe idea proposes that anomalies near the Sphinx indicate a deliberately engineered subterranean complex too significant to disclose, because it would overturn accepted history. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because geophysical language sounds technical enough to feel like proof from a distance. Terms like reflection, resistivity, void signature, and subsurface anomaly carry scientific weight, and people understandably assume they imply certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. They imply data. Data still needs interpretation. Most historians agree that interpretation is where caution matters most. A more cautious explanation could be that geophysical methods are extremely valuable precisely because they help avoid unnecessary digging at fragile heritage sites. Instead of tearing into the ground whenever someone feels excited, researchers can map, compare, test, and decide where investigation is worth the risk. That may look slow, it may feel secretive to outsiders when access is limited and results are debated, but slow is often what care looks like when the monument is older than nearly every institution talking about it. You can almost picture the modern scene now layered over the ancient one. Not labourers hauling sand this time, but technicians setting equipment, researchers reviewing plots, conservators worrying about vibration, officials balancing permissions, and someone in the background saying, "Can we please not promise a hidden chamber before we finish processing the data?" It is less cinematic in the obvious way. It is cinematic in the quiet way, where stakes are high because one wrong move can damage the very thing you are trying to understand. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is documented that geophysical tools can detect subsurface anomalies. It is interpretation to infer what those anomalies may represent at a specific location near the Sphinx. It becomes imagination when a signal turns into a complete underground archive with column scrolls and a dramatic draft of air at the entrance. And yet, imagination still has a place if we keep it soft. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can stand in your mind beside the Sphinx and wonder whether the instruments are hearing natural fractures, old cuts, unknown voids, or some combination that does not fit neatly into a headline. Archaeology suggests the site still has questions left in it. Most historians agree that unanswered questions are normal at monuments this old and complex. Historians still argue whether specific signals justify stronger claims, and the ongoing debate is not a cover-up. It is the sound of careful work moving at desert pace. So the eighth clue settles gently into place. Modern scans may whisper, but they do not sing a final answer. Anomalies are clues, not conclusions. Signals are possibilities, not maps. And if the Sphinx is keeping anything from us, it may simply be doing what ancient stone does best, forcing modern tools and modern minds to admit where the line between knowledge and interpretation still stands. By this point, you've walked through stone sand dynastic memory, uneven archives, and modern instruments that politely refuse to become prophecy. And now, inevitably, we arrive at the most famous underground idea attached to the Sphinx, the one that shows up in books, documentaries, internet forums, late night conversations, and probably at least one cousin's voice note, the Hall of Records. Most historians agree that the Hall of Records beneath or near the Sphinx is not a mainstream conclusion in Egyptian archaeology. What's broadly accepted is that this idea belongs to a modern mythic tradition shaped by esoteric speculation, popular storytelling, and reinterpretations of ancient Egypt rather than by publicly accepted archaeological confirmation. That does not make it uninteresting. It makes it a different kind of evidence. Instead of being evidence for a chamber, it becomes evidence for what modern people want Egypt to mean. And that is a fascinating artifact in its own right. A fringe idea proposes that a hidden archive, often called the Hall of Records, lies beneath the Sphinx and preserves ancient knowledge from a lost civilization, a forgotten priesthood, or a vanished age before dynastic Egypt. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains remarkably durable. One interpretation is that it combines several irresistible motifs into one elegant package: buried wisdom, sacred, guardianship, selective access, and the promise that history is only the visible cover page of a much older book. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask a calmer question. Why this myth and why here? Archaeology suggests the Sphinx is exactly the kind of monument that attracts archive myths because it already sits at the intersection of age, partial burial, restoration history, and incomplete certainty. The evidence we do have points to a real site with real gaps in knowledge. Add a giant human-animal guardian image and a globally famous desert setting, and the imaginative leap almost writes itself. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the Hall of Records myth survives not because it is proven, but because it dramatizes a feeling many people have when facing the Sphinx, the feeling that knowledge is nearby, ancient, and just out of reach? Historians still argue whether the modern endurance of the Hall of Records idea reflects mainly media amplification, spiritual reinterpretation of Egyptian symbols, dissatisfaction with academic caution, or a broader cultural hunger for hidden truth narratives. That's a possibility, not a certainty, because myths can survive for several reasons at once. One person is drawn to the romance of secret libraries. Another loves anti-establishment stories. Another simply likes the image of stone paws guarding scrolls in cool darkness while the desert sun burns above. Honestly, as visuals go, it is difficult to compete with that. You can feel how powerful the image is even while keeping the solid ground separate from the mist. A hidden chamber, shelves of records, ancient maps, a preserved history no one has fully read. It is cinematic, elegant, and emotionally satisfying. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And the Hall of Records offers a fantasy version of closure. If only we open the right door, everything makes sense. Archaeology, by contrast, usually offers partial answers, disputed interpretations, and careful footwork around fragile stone. The myth promises revelation. The field often delivers patience. A popular rumour claims authorities already know where the Hall of Records is, and have chosen not to reveal it for political, academic, or spiritual reasons, will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. This theory isn't widely accepted, and versions of the story often combine claims from different authors' traditions and decades into one seamless narrative that sounds older and more coherent than it really is. A more cautious explanation could be that restricted access, ambiguous survey results, and the prestige of the Sphinx create a perfect environment for they know more than they say storytelling. That kind of storytelling is not unique to Egypt, but Egypt gives it excellent scenery. Most historians agree that no publicly accepted excavation result has confirmed a giant hidden archive beneath the Sphinx matching Hall of Records legends. The evidence we do have points instead to a layered history of restoration, investigation, interpretation, and rumour. Archaeology suggests caution, not because the site is unimportant, but because it is extraordinarily important. When a monument becomes symbolic on a global scale, every claim attached to it grows larger than life. A careful reading might suggest the Hall of Records myth tells us as much about modern hopes and anxieties as it does about ancient stone. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is documented that the Hall of Records idea is a popular modern legend tied to the Sphinx in public imagination. It is interpretation to explain why that legend persists across generations. It becomes imagination when the archive is described in detailed certainty, complete with contents, architecture, and motives for concealment without accepted archaeological support. And yet, imagination does not have to be the enemy here. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the Hall of Records can function as a useful mirror. It shows what people long for in the past: continuity, wisdom, secret order, a sense that history has not been lost, but only hidden. You can stand before the Sphinx and feel that longing without pretending it is evidence. That may be the most honest version of wonder. A more cautious explanation could be that the true records beneath the Sphinx, if we speak poetically, are geological layers, tool marks, repair phases, sand deposits, and old inscriptions like the Dream Stele, all of them fragmented and difficult to read. Not a perfect library, but a scattered archive written in limestone and labour. Less dramatic than crystal vaults and golden shelves perhaps, but more faithful to how archaeology usually works. You recover traces, not totalities. You build stories from what survives. You keep the mist visible without mistaking it for the ground. So the ninth clue settles beside the others. The Hall of Records myth is not mainstream archaeology, but it is an important part of the Sphinx story because it reveals how modern imagination gathers around unanswered questions. The myth may not give us a confirmed chamber, it gives us a map of desire, and tonight that too is worth studying, as long as we remember which part is stone and which part is dream. From the outside, a lock gate always looks more dramatic than a conservation report. You can feel that tension now as the story moves from myths and scans into something less glamorous and far more important, access. Why can't people just dig open test or take a quick look beneath a monument as famous as the Sphinx? Why does the answer so often sound like, no, not now, not there, not like that? If you are standing at a distance, especially after hearing years of rumours, the restrictions can feel suspicious. If you are responsible for a fragile site, the restrictions can feel barely sufficient. The evidence we do have points to a basic reality of archaeology. At major heritage sites, excavation is not just curiosity plus shovel. Most historians agree that work at places like Giza involves permits, conservation priorities, institutional oversight and site management decisions that go far beyond one researcher's theory or one TV crew's excitement. What's broadly accepted is that the Sphinx is not only an ancient monument, it is also a protected cultural symbol, a conservation challenge, and a heavily visited heritage site. That combination makes access slower, narrower, and more controlled than the public often expects. And yes, that can look mysterious from behind a barrier. Archaeology suggests that restrictions around a monument like the Sphinx can come from multiple practical concerns, at once structural stability, erosion, risk, groundwater issues, visitor safety, conservation of previous repairs, the need for non-invasive testing before invasive work, and the simple fact that one careless intervention can damage evidence permanently. A more cautious explanation could be that what outsiders call secrecy is often risk management. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every individual case, because institutions can be inconsistent and communication can be clumsy. But the baseline logic is not strange. Ancient stone is fragile, and the Sphinx has already survived enough enthusiastic humans. Historians still argue whether some official decisions about access testing or excavation around the Sphinx have been communicated clearly enough to the public, or whether poor communication itself has helped fuel rumours of concealment. That debate matters. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And when institutions say little, the silence gets filled very quickly, usually by the loudest voice in the room, sometimes by a man with a microphone and a dramatic map, sometimes by an internet thread that begins with "I'm just asking questions" and ends with Atlantis. One interpretation is that restricted access creates a storytelling vacuum. You hear that a location is protected. You hear that permits are required. You hear that certain areas are closed or monitored. You do not see the internal discussions about conservation stress, documentation standards, or engineering risk. So the visible facts become simple and cinematic, famous monument blocked entrance, no permission. A popular rumour claims that this must mean something extraordinary has already been found and hidden, will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often confuses ordinary heritage management with deliberate concealment. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the locked door feeling around the Sphinx is partly a modern mismatch between public imagination and archaeological method? Public imagination wants quick access and dramatic revelation. Archaeological method wants slow surveys, controlled contexts, and long-term preservation. Those two rhythms do not naturally get along. One wants a season finale. The other wants 5 years of careful notes and a meeting about stone salts. To be fair, the meeting about stone salts is probably important. Most historians agree that conservation can require recovering, stabilising fencing, or limiting access to areas even after they have been examined. The evidence we do have points to a principle that often frustrates outsiders. Seeing a feature is not the same as opening it up for everyone. Even documented areas can be restricted if exposure increases damage risk. Archaeology suggests that in fragile settings, doing less can be a form of protection rather than avoidance. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, why won't they let anyone explore it? Questions may have a plain answer. Sometimes explore, in the public sense, would threaten exactly what professionals are trying to preserve. A fringe idea proposes that Egyptian authorities and scholars are intentionally preventing exploration because the truth beneath the Sphinx would overturn accepted history. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains powerful because it gives every denial a dramatic meaning. Permit denied cover-up, area restricted cover-up, conservation barrier, very stylish cover-up. A more cautious explanation could be that national heritage management at an iconic site must balance scholarship, preservation, tourism, safety, politics, staffing, and public messaging all at once. That can produce decisions that look opaque from the outside without requiring a hidden chamber at the centre. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is documented that major heritage sites are managed through restrictions and controlled access. It is interpretation to connect specific communication gaps to rising Sphinx rumours. It becomes imagination when every closed area is treated as proof of a suppressed discovery. You can almost feel the emotional split now as you stand in your mind near the enclosure. The monument invites wonder. The barriers invite suspicion. The signs, rules, and guarded spaces make modern administration part of the ancient experience. It is a strange pairing, but maybe an honest one. The Sphinx has always required mediation of some kind. Priests, restorers, rulers, excavators, conservators, officials. Different eras, same basic fact. Not everyone gets to walk everywhere. And perhaps that is the 10th clue. Why won't anyone let us explore it? May sound like a single question, but it contains several. Who is anyone? What counts as explore? What level of risk is acceptable? What evidence justifies intrusion? Once you unpack those, the wall between mystery and management gets thinner, not gone, just thinner. And in that thinner space, you can finally see how protection can look like secrecy, even when the real story is caution paperwork and the burden of guarding something the whole world thinks it already understands. Once you notice the barriers, permits, and conservation rhythms, it becomes easier to see the next layer of the puzzle. The Sphinx is not only an archaeological object, it is also a national symbol, a tourism icon, a classroom image, a political backdrop, a documentary favourite, a meme generator, and the kind of monument people think they already know before they arrive. That changes everything. A site can be ancient in stone and modern in pressure at the same time. What's broadly accepted is that Giza is one of the world's most visible heritage landscapes, and a major part of Egypt's cultural identity and tourism economy. Most historians agree that this visibility shapes how the site is managed, presented, protected, and discussed in public. Archaeology suggests that scholarship does not happen in a vacuum here. Every statement about the Sphinx, every rumour, every restriction, every survey result, and every media clip lands inside a much larger ecosystem of national pride, global curiosity, and commercial storytelling. And commercial storytelling, as a species, does not usually choose the headline "ambiguous limestone variation receives thoughtful review." One interpretation is that public fascination with what's beneath the Sphinx grows stronger because the monument sits at the intersection of authority and distance. Egypt has custodianship, experts have methods, visitors have limited time and access, audiences around the world have endless theories and no dust in their shoes. A careful reading might suggest that this arrangement almost guarantees friction. When people cannot directly inspect a famous site, they rely on images, narrators, and selective clips, and those channels often reward drama over nuance. Historians still argue whether popular media coverage of the Sphinx has increased public curiosity in helpful ways, distorted expectations, with sensational framing, or both at once. That's a possibility, not a certainty, because public storytelling can do several contradictory things at the same time. A dramatic documentary may oversell a claim and still inspire someone to study archaeology seriously. A careful museum exhibit may educate thousands and still get ignored by the person who just wants the hidden chamber map. Human attention is not a neat system. It is more like a marketplace where facts, vibes, and thumbnails share the same stall. The evidence we do have points to a real tension between heritage protection and entertainment culture. Archaeology suggests that at globally famous sites, scholars and officials often have to communicate in an environment where silence can be misread and complexity can be edited out. A more cautious explanation could be that some official messaging around the Sphinx aims to prevent misinformation, but can sound overly controlled, while some media narratives claim to reveal hidden truths, but blur the line between interpretation and speculation. Both sides may believe they are defending the monument in different ways. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And public imagination does not like waiting quietly in that gap. A popular rumour claims that Egypt refuses exploration beneath the Sphinx, because a discovery there would disrupt national narratives or global historical institutions. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often reduces a complex heritage system into a single motive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a more cautious explanation could be that national symbolism increases sensitivity around the site, making authorities especially careful about claims, access, and public framing. That is not the same thing as hiding a chamber. It may simply be what happens when the monument in question appears on postcards, textbooks, and everyone's bucket list. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the Sphinx rumour machine thrives because the monument is too famous to stay purely archaeological? The more iconic a site becomes, the more meanings gather around it. Ancient kingship, colonial era fascination, modern nationhood, tourism branding, spiritual projection, internet mystery culture. Each layer adds language and expectations. By the time someone asks, why won't they let anyone explore beneath it, the question may already contain assumptions from 5 different worlds. If you listen closely, you can almost hear those worlds talking over one another. A conservator worries about stone decay. A tourism operator worries about visitor flow. A scholar worries about evidence standards. A journalist worries about attention span. A viewer worries that the truth is being hidden. A local guide tries to balance accuracy with wonder because guests paid for wonder and also have a bus schedule. Nobody is necessarily lying. They are standing in different systems with different incentives. Most historians agree that this is normal at major heritage sites, even if the Sphinx amplifies it more than most. The evidence we do have points to an object so symbolically charged that every procedural decision can look larger than itself. Fence placement becomes a statement. Permit language becomes a clue. Delayed publication becomes suspicion. Historians still argue whether the best response is more open public communication, stricter control of claims, or some awkward middle path where nobody is fully satisfied and everyone writes long emails. That last option, to be fair, is the most historically realistic. A fringe idea proposes that the Sphinx is intentionally maintained as a managed mystery because uncertainty itself serves political and economic interests. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is interesting as a lens. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it raises a softer point. Famous monuments do not only preserve the past, they also generate present-day narratives, and those narratives can become part of the site's modern life, whether anyone planned it or not. Mystery attracts attention. Attention funds infrastructure. Infrastructure shapes access. Access shapes new mystery. Around and around it goes. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is documented that Giza is both a heritage treasure and a public-facing national symbol. It is interpretation to connect that status to how Sphinx rumours spread and persist. It becomes imagination when every communication choice is treated as proof of a coordinated mythology campaign. So the 11th clue settles in as the day on the plateau grows brighter and louder in your mind. The Sphinx is not just a monument under investigation, it is a monument under narration constantly. And once you see that the question, why won't they let anyone explore it, starts to sound less like a pure archaeological puzzle and more like a modern one, too shaped by tourism, pride storytelling, institutions, and the very human habit of trusting the most exciting version first. By now, the big emotional shape of the mystery is clearer. The Sphinx invites wonder. The archives leave gaps. The scans produce signals. Access gets restricted, and public narratives fill every silence. So the next question is simple and practical, and maybe a little less cinematic than people expect. What do scientists and archaeologists actually do when they study a place like this? Not what movies do, not what internet threads do at 2:14 a.m, what the real work looks like. What's broadly accepted is that modern research at fragile heritage sites usually prioritises documentation, stability assessment, conservation needs, and non-invasive investigation before invasive excavation. Most historians agree that this approach is especially important at major monuments like the Sphinx, where damage from poorly planned interventions could be irreversible. Archaeology suggests that the first job is often not find the secret, but understand the condition. That means mapping surfaces, monitoring deterioration, studying past repairs, evaluating environmental stress, and using targeted methods to ask narrow questions carefully. You can see why this loses to a thumbnail with glowing tunnels, but it is still the better way. One interpretation is that the public often experiences scientific caution as emotional withholding. A careful reading might suggest the opposite. Caution is not the absence of curiosity. It is curiosity under discipline. The evidence we do have points to a monument with complex geology, extensive weathering, multiple restoration histories, and enormous symbolic value. In that setting, slow science is not timidity, it is respect. Historians still argue whether particular research priorities around the Sphinx should focus more on conservation and stabilisation, on non-invasive subsurface investigation, or on carefully limited excavation in selected contexts. That debate is normal. It's possible that different experts emphasise different risks because they are trained to see different kinds of loss. A conservator may fear damage to stone surfaces. A geophysicist may fear missed data from delayed surveys. An excavator may fear losing context if later disturbance continues unchecked. Nobody has to be a villain for the priorities to clash. Archaeology suggests that non-invasive methods such as surface mapping and geophysical survey approaches can help researchers identify where questions are worth pursuing while minimising disturbance. The evidence we do have points to a process of narrowing uncertainty rather than eliminating it all at once. A signal appears. It is compared with known geology. It is cross-checked against historical records. It is evaluated against conservation constraints. Maybe it leads to further testing. Maybe it does not. A more cautious explanation could be that nothing dramatic happened is often a successful research outcome, especially when a fragile monument remains unharmed and a bad hypothesis gets ruled out. That may not be thrilling, but science does not owe us thrills. It owes us honesty. A popular rumour claims that scientists already know exactly what lies beneath the Sphinx and are stalling because they cannot agree how to reveal it. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it usually exaggerates both the certainty of available data and the secrecy of normal research timelines. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a more cautious explanation could be that research moves slowly because the questions are hard. The site is delicate and responsible. Methods produce incremental results. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and careful science spends most of its time managing that boundary. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real hidden thing beneath the Sphinx in modern terms is process rather than treasure? Not a chamber full of records, but a deep stack of work measurements, condition reports, scans, comparisons, debates, test proposals, permit reviews, conservation planning, and yes, the occasional deeply unglamorous meeting about moisture and stone decay. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, this hidden process explanation can feel almost disappointingly ordinary, until you realise it is exactly how knowledge gets built without breaking the site. And it is harder than it looks. Most historians agree that archaeological knowledge often advances through small corrections instead of giant revelations. The evidence we do have points to a pattern at many famous sites. Public imagination waits for one dramatic discovery, while researchers slowly improve the map of what is known, what is likely, and what remains unresolved. One interpretation is that this mismatch creates frustration that feeds rumours. If science sounds tentative certainty from fringe, theories can feel emotionally stronger. Maybe is harder to market than they found it. But maybe when used well is one of the most honourable words in scholarship. A fringe idea proposes that non-invasive research is just a performance, and that authorities avoid real excavation because they fear what would be found. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because caution can resemble hesitation from a distance. Let me rephrase that more carefully. caution is visible. The reasons for caution are often invisible. You do not see stress fractures, salt damage risks, subsurface instability concerns, or the chain of consequences that one aggressive intervention might set off. You mostly see that the monument is still there, and the answer is still incomplete. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is documented that conservation and non-invasive methods are central to modern heritage science. It is interpretation to connect that methodological pace to public suspicion at the Sphinx. It becomes imagination when every delay is framed as proof of a suppressed discovery rather than a complex scientific and administrative process. You can almost feel the rhythm of the real work now, and it is not dramatic in the usual way. It is steady, careful, repetitive. Dust on boots, data on screens, stone under watch. The Sphinx remains in place while generations of researchers ask narrower and better questions. Historians still argue whether one line of testing should come before another, but that argument itself is part of the discipline, not a sign that the discipline has failed. So the 12th clue settles into your hands with a quieter weight. What scientists actually test is often not the fantasy itself, but the conditions that would allow a safe and meaningful answer. Stability before intrusion, mapping before excavation, signals before claims. Slow science may not satisfy the appetite for instant revelation, but at a monument like the Sphinx, slow is often the only honest speed. By now you've walked far enough into this mystery to notice something important. The biggest disagreements are not always between believers and skeptics in the dramatic internet comment sense. Many of the most meaningful disagreements happen inside the evidence itself, in the stone, in the cuts, in the repairs, in the way one feature can look natural at first glance and modified at second glance, or ancient in one context and much later in another. This is where the story becomes less about a single hidden chamber and more about how knowledge is built in layers. Most historians agree on many basics about the Sphinx, its broad, Old Kingdom context, its association with the Giza royal landscape, its long history of burial and restoration, and the need for careful conservation. What's broadly accepted is that the monument has undergone extensive weathering damage and repair across millennia. Archaeology suggests that because of this long and altered history, some features around the Sphinx can be difficult to interpret cleanly. The evidence we do have points to a real challenge. You are not always looking at one moment in time. You are looking at many moments occupying the same stone. Historians still argue whether particular features near or on the Sphinx and its enclosure are primarily natural formations, ancient modifications, later restorations, modern interventions, or combinations of these. That exact phrase matters because combinations are often the true answer and also the least satisfying one if you wanted a neat mystery reveal. A careful reading might suggest that the site resists single cause explanations. A crack may be geological and later widened. A cut may be ancient and later repaired. A void may begin naturally and then be reused or altered. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every case, but it is a common pattern at old monuments. And old monuments, like old houses, love mixed causes, except the Sphinx is a house the size of a legend, and nobody can call a plumber without 4 permits. One interpretation is that public discussions often mistake scholarly disagreement for evidence of concealment. The logic goes something like this. If experts disagree, then the truth must be hidden. A more cautious explanation could be that disagreement is exactly what you should expect when experts are working honestly with incomplete, layered, and sometimes ambiguous evidence. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And scholars continue to debate, because debate is how they test interpretations against that limit. Archaeology suggests that argument, when done carefully, is not a crack in the field. It is a tool of the field. Different specialists bring different methods and priorities. Geologists read stone formation and erosion patterns. Archaeologists read context and human modification. Conservators read damage history and intervention traces. Architectural historians read design logic and phase relationships. The evidence we do have points to a site where these readings must be woven together, and sometimes they pull in slightly different directions before a stronger consensus forms. A popular rumour claims that expert disagreement about the Sphinx proves something major is being hidden beneath it, because they can't even agree on what's there. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often confuses ordinary scholarly uncertainty with institutional secrecy. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a more cautious explanation could be that famous sites attract more public attention to normal academic debate than less famous sites do. Scholars disagree about many monuments. The Sphinx simply gets better camera angles. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real lesson in these debates is that the Sphinx is not a sealed riddle, but a heavily used, heavily repaired, heavily interpreted place, where every feature carries more than one possible history? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, beneath the Sphinx may include not just physical space under stone, but buried interpretive layers under every visible surface. The hidden thing may be complexity itself. A fringe idea proposes that scholars maintain artificial debate around Sphinx features to avoid admitting a radical alternative history. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it can sound persuasive to people who encounter the debates without context. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The existence of debate does not tell you which side is right, and it does not automatically imply bad faith. It tells you the evidence is difficult, the stakes are high, or both. Sometimes it also tells you that experts are being more honest than people who speak in certainty. Most historians agree that certainty should be earned, especially at a site where damage, restoration, and incomplete records complicate the picture. The evidence we do have points to a discipline trying to separate natural features from human work and original phases from later additions with as much care as the surviving material allows. One interpretation is that this kind of slow distinction making can feel less exciting than a single answer, but it is exactly what keeps the field from drifting into fantasy. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues, and clues often come with arguments attached. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is documented that scholars debate how to interpret some features around the Sphinx. It is interpretation to explain why that debate is often misread by the public. It becomes imagination when disagreement is recast as a theatrical performance, hiding a complete secret map beneath the monument. You can almost hear the debates now if you stand quietly in your mind at the edge of the enclosure. Not angry shouting mostly, more like careful voices, measured words, hand gestures over stone surfaces, people crouching to inspect edges and textures, someone saying possibly, someone else saying not enough evidence, and a third person saying we need better data. It is not glamorous, but it is deeply human. The Sphinx sits there while modern minds try to read a damaged script written across thousands of years. So the 13th clue settles into place. Disagreement at the Sphinx is not a sign that scholarship is broken. It is often a sign that scholarship is still working. Historians still argue whether specific features are natural modified or later additions because the monument is complex, not because the answers are being hidden in a locked drawer. And if you can learn to hear debate as method instead of menace, the mystery becomes calmer, richer, and much more interesting. By now, you've carried a lot of clues: the living bedrock, the Khafra landscape, the Dream Stele, the sand cycles, the old records, the modern scans, the Hall of Records, myth, the barriers, the media pressure, the slow science, the scholarly debates. And if you lay them side by side, a pattern begins to emerge that is both less flashy and more profound than the simple hidden room story. The word beneath is doing a lot of work. Most historians agree that the Giza plateau is a complex geological and archaeological environment, not a neat stage floor under a single monument. What's broadly accepted is that beneath the Sphinx may refer to bedrock layers, natural fissures, quarry cuts, fill deposits, restoration zones, and localized features of different ages and origins. Archaeology suggests that subsurface complexity at Giza is normal, and the evidence we do have points to a landscape that mixes natural structure and human intervention in ways that can be hard to separate without very specific context. In other words, beneath may be real without being theatrical. One interpretation is that public imagination hears the phrase, "What's beneath the Sphinx?" and immediately pictures a single hidden chamber with walls, contents, and a dramatic purpose. A more cautious explanation could be that the most important hidden reality is the process by which the plateau was formed, cut, used, repaired, and reinterpreted across time. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every detail, but it aligns with what we've followed all night. Stone first, then cuts, then sand, then restoration, then rumours, then instruments, then debates. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and much of what we can't confirm may be distributed across the landscape rather than locked in one room. Historians still argue whether some subsurface features associated with the Sphinx area are better understood as geological formations, remnants of ancient quarrying or construction activity, later disturbances, or combinations of these. Notice how often combinations return. The evidence we do have points to overlapping histories, and overlaps do not make good movie posters. They make better archaeology. A careful reading might suggest that the hidden thing under the Sphinx is not a secret waiting to be revealed, but a set of relationships waiting to be modelled correctly. That sounds technical, because it is. It is also in its own way beautiful. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the phrase beneath the Sphinx has misled us by sounding too singular? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the stronger question may be, what kinds of subsurface conditions, features, and traces belong to this monument's life history, and how do they fit the wider plateau? That question allows for caves of uncertainty without demanding a cathedral of certainty. Archaeology suggests that landscapes often preserve evidence as patterns, not as single dramatic finds. The evidence we do have points to this possibility at Giza too. A trench here, a cut there, a fill layer, a repair seam, a change in stone quality, an anomaly that may be natural, another that may be anthropogenic, a protected area that cannot be aggressively tested. Put together, they form a complicated underground picture that may never reduce neatly to yes, there is a chamber, or no, there is nothing at all. Most historians agree that such outcomes are common in real research and deeply frustrating in internet discussions. A popular rumour claims that officials use geology as a convenient excuse to dismiss evidence of hidden architecture beneath the Sphinx. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often treats geology as if it were the boring alternative to history instead of one of the keys to the history. A more cautious explanation could be that geology is precisely what allows researchers to distinguish natural voids from human-made spaces, or to admit when the distinction remains uncertain. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A fringe idea proposes that beneath the Sphinx lies a vast engineered complex intentionally disguised to appear geological. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because it elegantly absorbs every objection. If a feature looks natural, the theory says it is disguised. If access is restricted, the theory says concealment. If results are ambiguous, the theory says partial disclosure. It is narratively flexible, which is another way of saying difficult to test. Let me rephrase that more carefully. A theory that can explain every outcome may feel powerful, but archaeology usually trusts explanations that can be constrained by evidence. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is documented that the plateau beneath and around the Sphinx is geologically and archaeologically complex. It is interpretation to emphasize landscape process over hidden room storytelling as the more useful framework. It becomes imagination when every ambiguity in the subsurface becomes a deliberate clue in a single secret plan. And yet even this more cautious framework leaves room for wonder. You can still stand in your mind beside the Sphinx and feel the depth under your feet. You can still imagine layers of work, weather, burial, clearing, and repair stacked below the visible stone. You can still ask whether there are features not fully understood. Historians still argue whether specific clues point toward human modification in some cases, and that ongoing uncertainty is part of the site's intellectual life. By now the day in your imagination is long and warm, and the monument looks less like a riddle carved in one moment and more like a threshold between many times. The face is visible. The process beneath it is not. The hidden thing may be a small feature, a natural cavity, a cut zone, a repair history, or a pattern that only emerges when enough disciplines talk to one another. That may not be the answer rumour culture wants. It may be the answer the Sphinx deserves. So the 14th clue settles softly like sand finding a hollow. Beneath the Sphinx may mean geology as much as chambers process, as much as object landscape, as much as monument. And if that sounds less dramatic than a secret room, stay with it a little longer. Sometimes the deeper mystery is not a door in the ground. Sometimes it is the slow realization that the ground itself is the archive. And now, after all this slow walking through stone and rumour and method, you arrive at the edge of the question itself, and it looks different than it did at the beginning. The Sphinx is still there, the face still unreadable, the pores still stretched forward, the desert still doing its patient work. But your question has changed. You are no longer asking only what is hidden beneath it. You are asking what kind of answer this monument can honestly give. What's broadly accepted is that no publicly accepted discovery has confirmed a giant hidden chamber beneath the Sphinx matching the most famous legends. Most historians agree that the monument remains one of the most studied and symbolically charged sites in Egypt. And archaeology suggests there are still open questions about aspects of its geology, history of modification, conservation, and interpretation. The evidence we do have points to a real puzzle, but not a simple one. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the Sphinx may be less a locked vault and more an open question in stone. And open questions can be harder to live with than locked doors. One interpretation is that the phrase, "why Egypt won't let anyone explore it," becomes less accusatory once you understand what explore means at a fragile site. A more cautious explanation could be that the refusal people feel is often a mixture of conservation limits, scientific caution, institutional control, and the plain difficulty of working safely at an ancient monument under global attention. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every case, and yes, communication gaps can still feed suspicion. But the solid ground is stronger now. You can see how protection debate and partial evidence create mystery without requiring a grand hidden truth. Historians still argue whether future non-invasive studies, improved methods, or carefully targeted investigations will clarify more about subsurface features near the Sphinx, or simply refine what we already suspect about a complex bedrock landscape. That debate is not a failure of scholarship. It is the shape of scholarship at the edge of uncertainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And tonight you've learned that this boundary is not empty. It is full of clues, methods, and competing interpretations trying to stay honest. A popular rumour claims the final answer is already known and deliberately withheld. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence usually offered for it is indirect, interpretive, or inconsistent. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more useful lesson may be this rumour survive because the Sphinx really does leave room for them. It is ancient, partially damaged, repeatedly buried, heavily restored, visually overwhelming, and never fully free from modern agendas. In a way, it is the perfect monument for unresolved stories. A fringe idea proposes that one future discovery beneath the Sphinx will overturn all accepted history at once. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it carries an emotional truth worth noticing. People want history to feel alive, and hidden chamber stories offer the thrill of unfinished knowledge. Most historians agree that real discoveries are usually more specific and less totalizing. They revise details, they sharpen timelines, they complicate old assumptions, they rarely erase everything. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The biggest archaeological gift is often not a single final answer, but a better question. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the reason the Sphinx matters so much in this debate is not because it definitely hides a secret chamber, but because it teaches you how to stand in uncertainty without turning uncertainty into certainty? Archaeology suggests that patience is part of the skill. The evidence we do have points to a monument that rewards careful observation and punishes dramatic overreach. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And there is something surprisingly comforting in that. You can imagine the plateau now in late light, the heat easing shadows stretching longer across stone and sand. The crowds thin in your mind. The noise drifts away. The Sphinx remains, not answering, not refusing, simply enduring. You have spent the night walking around the idea of what might be beneath it. And perhaps the most honest answer is this: There may be features, voids, cuts and complexities not fully resolved, but no single legend gets to own the monument. Not the Hall of Records, not the cover-up story, not the nothing to see here shrug either. The Sphinx is larger than all of those. Most historians agree that is part of its power. So if someone asks you tomorrow what lies beneath the Sphinx and why Egypt won't let anyone explore it, you can answer more gently than the headlines do. You can say that archaeology suggests a complicated bedrock and monument history. You can say historians still argue whether some clues point to natural features, human modifications, or later changes. You can say restrictions often reflect preservation, a method though public communication can leave room for rumour. You can say we're not proving anything, we're following clues. And if they seem disappointed there is no golden library reveal, you can remind them that real ancient mysteries are rarely neat. They are layered, weathered, interrupted, and still beautiful. Which honestly is a very Sphinx-like way to be. Now let the pace soften. Let the stone face blur a little at the edges as evening settles over the plateau in your imagination. Let the heat leave the limestone slowly, the way a day leaves your body when you finally stop carrying it. The sand no longer feels like a thing to cross-examine. It simply drifts where the wind asks it to drift. The questions you brought with you do not need to be solved tonight. They can rest beside the monument, half in shadow, half in moonlit outline. You have your clues. You have the solid ground and the mist, and you know how to keep them separate without losing the wonder. Somewhere out there, the Sphinx keeps its long watch over stone memory and human imagination, and it does not hurry for anyone. Not for kings, not for explorers, not for cameras, not for theories, and not for us tonight. And that may be the gentlest lesson it offers. You do not need a final answer to feel the weight of history. You only need enough quiet to hear the unanswered parts without fear. So let the plateau grow still. Let the old lion body sink back into the dark in your mind, not hidden, just resting. Let the question remain a question, and let yourself sleep under a sky that has watched people wonder about this monument for far longer than any rumour has lasted.